a minute. There. Right, so that goes the back of your head and over the front of your ears.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like that?
Yeah. And then, so you're live now, just try it.
All right, okay.
Yeah, you can.
All right.
And so I'll mute it, so that's just that back.
Shall we begin? I'm going to come a cropper with this microphone, I'm sure. But whatever. Well, I think the first thing to say is I will speak with neither the length nor with the erudition of Simon. So, there's sort of gains and losses. You can weigh them for yourselves. And also, as Simon said at the start, this is less abstract. So we're coming down a little bit. Abstraction, though, as Simon said, absolutely necessary. But life becomes so much complicated when you have the living reality of historical evolution. But I guess, as somebody once said, there's no royal road to science. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about finance, but I'm going to be looking at it in very much sort of contemporary context, and in terms of the sort of historical evolution. I'll try to look at it in terms of the historical evolution of the capitalist mode of production, or at least raise some questions about the historical evolution of the capitalist mode of production, if perhaps not quite answering them, because I have questions too. So just to look at the outline of what I'll talk about, the title of this session is called Approaches to Financialisation, and I'm aware that some of you will be very familiar with the literature on financialisation and some of you will be less familiar. So firstly, we should talk about what it is and why it matters, and even perhaps what it is and how to fight it, as we used to say. There's kind of no shortcut in the sense that there are different dimensions to financialisation, and you just, in some ways, you just have to understand it. You do have to break it down into its constituent parts, and then think about how you put them back together again. So a very, very critical question here is the way in which non-financial corporations, classic big capitalist enterprises, like, your Fords and your General Motors, classic commodity producers, are themselves becoming increasingly involved in finance. in different ways in financial operations. And so that's a very, very critical dimension to financialisation. What's going on in the circuit of productive capital in relation to finance, so which relates back to Simon. Then obviously finance, there's a question of banks and central banks. I'm not going to say enough about banks and central banks. I'm hoping Duncan will cover a bit of it, but maybe not. And also households, a very important dimension of financialisation, is debt, the question of debt and the changing nature of debt. And you've also got the whole nature of impact of financialisation and its specific forms in the developing world. So now that raising the questions of how do North and South fit together, even raising questions about contemporary forms of imperialism. So big questions, and I can't cover. Don't worry, I'm not going to cover all those things. I'm going to skate, casually over huge areas. Glibly, perhaps. But finance does take a different form. Financialisation is clearly taking different forms and having specific effects in developing economies. So then you get that whole nature of the interaction. And throughout, I want to try to say that the role of the state is very critical here, and that whilst we're all suffering under the ideology of neoliberalism, which is supposed to be rolling back the power of the state, actually state intervention in promoting the financial sector and financial interests and in promoting financialised accumulation has been critical all the way. So, we need to understand the nature and the forms of state intervention in these processes. So the state, if anyone who thinks the state's the thing of the past, I don't agree with you. It's a critical driver. So that, I'll cover that very sketchily, I'm sure. Obviously, we need history. There's a historical roots to this, and that. We need to look at the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, which entailed a much more regulated international financial system than the one we have at present, and its replacement by the neoliberal ideology and 3 decades of growth and change in finance, and so how there's been a historical evolution in global and national financial systems, and the impact of that. Let me say this: the state and these, there are very general and important global changes, and we need to understand those general important global changes. But also, if you look at the level of national economies, national specificities still matter enormously, and that even if you look at people will know perhaps RMF, Research on Money and Finance, which is based at SOAS and which Duncan Lindo is involved in. They've produced many working papers, and even if you look at their work, and even if you look at the kind of clear trends towards financialisation in the industrial capitalist core, there are still significant differences between the United States, Britain, Germany, and Japan. So national particularities matter, and they still matter, even though we've got this kind of global financial change. So we'll look at that a little. Then, just to recap in terms of some of the outcomes of financialisation, which are now really generally agreed upon, which is the importance of finance to growth, to driving growth in the world economy, to the importance of finance to crises and repeated crises, but also the importance of finance to inequality and renewing inequality across the global economy and national societies. So they're important. Obviously, once we've got a bit of grip on it, there are different theoretical ways of understanding it, and there are. I think the term financialisation itself is really one that's come to the fore within heterodox political economy. So financialisation is really the study of it is dominated really by Marxist and post-Keynesian approaches. I think that's fair to say. And neither are homogeneous. So there's several varieties of Marxist approaches. There are several varieties of post-Keynesian approaches, and they have things in common as well as things which differentiate them. So I'll try and talk about that, and then obviously I'm going to give you my take on it, which is just what you do, which you can take or leave, obviously. But I think it is helpful to look at finance and financialisation in relation to Marx's circuits of capital, and particularly in relation to important changes since Hilferding's time, because in terms of Marxist political economy, really moving on from Simon, from Marx, a really very, very important staging point in looking at finance is Hilferding's book Finance Capital. So the differences between what's taking place today and what Hilferding saw are actually it's a useful way of illuminating the processes at work here. And then I'll try and draw. I'm going to ask a few questions in the conclusion, because I want to know what you think. But obviously, there's the whole question of, can you put the genie back in the bottle? Is finance now so? Is it out of control? Can it be put back in the bottle? Is it reformable, and so forth? Okay, so that's the plan anyway. We'll see how it goes. Financialisation, what it is and why it matters. So we have, I think, to put it boldly to start with, we've seen important changes in developed and developing capitalist economies in the last 3 decades. And the role of finance has been pivotal in these changes. Finance is central. And financial capital now permeates both economy and society in historically unprecedented ways. Simon mentioned the subprime mortgages. It's perhaps useful to remind ourselves that the origins of the 2007 economic crisis, which went on to become a kind of a massive crisis of global manufacturing, began with the subprime crisis in the United States. So that's basically some of the poorest people in America defaulting on their mortgage repayments. So for that to trigger a global financial crisis is historically unprecedented, which, I know so many years on, it's worth reminding ourselves of the significance of that. That's historically new. So we've got the growth and the permeation of finance across economy and society, and arguably culture as well, which I'm not going to touch on, but that's not because it's not important. We've also seen in the kind of under the heading of the neoliberal period, really the domination of economic policy by the concerns of the financial sector, and the shaping of macroeconomic policy and macroeconomic frameworks by the interests of finance, crudely put. The whole inflation targeting paradigm, whole idea of central bank independence. These are very, critical blocks of neoliberalism. These are very much in the interest of the financial sector. Inflation undermines the value of your assets. Inflation is a very, very, very big problem if you're an owner of financial assets, or if you advance loanable money capital. Inflation is a big problem, and that the idea that somehow central banks would be more neutral in pursuing a stable inflation, that central banks could be trusted more than politicians, was the argument. Combined with these changes, we've seen, to put it generally, very weak growth, profit rates substantially below the boom years. We've seen, in many different contexts, rising unemployment, real wages often stagnant, and we've seen kind of poor performance, if you like, of industrial capital at the same time as quite a lot of new technology, quite a lot of labour market restructuring, quite a lot of change that you would think would be favourable to capital, and actually has been favourable to capital, but hasn't been favourable to industrial capital. So the rise of finance and the slowing pace of real accumulation. That's the kind of big story of the world economy for the last 3 decades. I think we can say. I find Kostas Slavovic's quite useful in when he says there are kind of 3 key elements of change we need to look at to help us, when we do the breaking it down and putting it back together again routine. So the 3 ones, firstly then, are, as I mentioned, the question of non-financial corporations. So, productive capitals, and how they are increasingly involved in financial processes, and in some ways are relatively remote from banks. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at there's lots of data, there's lots of studies that show what you see is a reliance on retained profits to fund the next future investment. Retained profits combined with borrowing on open markets. Which means that if you were to imagine yourself a transnational corporation, difficult leap, I know, if your future investment is from either your retained earnings or from borrowing on financial markets, you are less dependent upon a bank. Okay, that may be no problem for you, but it might be a problem for banks. Okay, so that's important. This is also this involvement of non-financial corporations in finance has also led to changes in the productive activities of non-financial corporations. The restructuring deeply connected with the growing financialisation of non-financial corporations. So which leads some, I like to talk about this notion of financialised accumulation. We're talking about the sort of the penetration of finance into the productive circuit of capital, which I'll try to talk about. So the second dimension is the question of the problem that this gives for banks, who have turned towards financial trading themselves. Banks are big financial traders. Duncan is the man here this afternoon, but banks are huge players in financial trading. The idea of banks as borrowing and lending, which is, the sort of idea that I grew up with, and the nice, respectable bank manager down at the Midland Bank and so on. Financial trading, but at the same time towards lending to individuals and households as a much bigger proportion of their activities. So just on the financial trading, international banks are major players in derivatives markets. The derivatives markets have grown, phenomenally. They're the kind of, obvious indication, most obvious perhaps indication and powerful indication of the rise of finance. They're really, really driven by a very few concentrated international banks, which is also connected to the increasing power of central banks that regulate the derivatives markets. And on the other hand, individual households increasingly reliant on the formal financial sector. And here we see growing indebtedness of households as a very, very general trend related to, as Simon was saying, housing, education, health, transport. Very, very kind of key things which relate to introduce the question of neoliberalism and the general shift in the attempt to push to cut back on public provision has helped fuel this. I'm not saying it's necessarily a plan, actually, but there's no doubt about it. So you see that the interconnections between neoliberalism and neoliberalism facilitating finance and the cutting back of public provision tied to individual household reliance on the formal financial sector. So we have deep changes across society. So I've talked about financialised accumulation, but also some people talk about financialised capitalism, which is, if you like, to sort of move from accumulation, if you like, to capitalism or capitalist society as a whole. That finance is sort of spreading right across the board. And then, I think it's important to mention the question of financialisation and the developing world, because it has quite different forms and particularities. If we think that God, I thought I wasn't going to talk for a longer Simon, but that hope is rapidly diminishing. I'm sorry. Specific and varying ways. If we think one of the very important parts of the impact of the 1973 global economic crisis was falling demand for exports from the developing world, which was a very important, so that reduced earnings, and that was a very important contributory factor to the debt crisis of the 80s. So we've got, we have that and then we see the lending and the debt crisis and IMF conditionality and loans, the structural adjustment programs that we're very familiar with. So that, that's an important stage in finance's involvement in developing economies. But subsequent to that, which we shouldn't forget, but subsequent to that, with the IMF, World Bank, and so forth, opening up of developing economies, we've seen a huge change in capital flows. It's complicated. If you look at the global picture, most flows of capital remain between developed economies. Largely, capitals in developed economies invest in other developed economies. And production and trade is very dominated by what is often referred to as the triad of the global economy, in general terms. But nevertheless, if you look at the question of capital flows to and from the developing world, you see the extraordinary thing is now you see the export of capital from developing to the developed. This is completely the opposite of the mainstream predictions of what financial liberalisation would produce. It's the complete opposite of the historic pattern of imperialism, of course. But it's an extremely important. Extremely important for developing economies themselves, and the reasons for it are complicated. There are different dimensions to it. One is, if you look at, I do work on South Africa, one important dimension for a country like South Africa, which does have big concentrated capitals, one explanation for it is simply just there's huge capital flight, as big corporations have wanted to engage in financialised accumulation on a more global basis. So they're expanding their global horizons and ambitions while contracting their domestic ones, which has a huge impact on investment and jobs and growth and so forth. So, and a very common form of it is, there's lots of tax evasion involved here, and there's lots of fiddling of your accounts in order to achieve this, but it's also connected to building up of reserves and the question of reserve accumulation, which I'll come back to if I have time. So, and combined with that, we see the impact of financial speculation on commodity prices and therefore export revenues, which financial speculation has hugely increased commodity prices, which you might think would be a boom. It's a complicated story. But both the combination of financial speculation and demand from China has increased commodity prices so that they're now actually counter-cyclical, which again is a huge change. But at the same time, we see liberalised financial systems attracting lots of short-term flows of hot money into the financial system, which is very unstable, reduces amounts of funds for long-term productive investment, and so forth. So, a complicated but important part of the story here. But as I said, financialisation not possible without the state. I'll say it again and again. There's the ideology of deregulation, of privatisation and liberalisation, but actually it's all actually about state intervention. It's about changing the form of regulation. We shouldn't really say deregulation. We should say re-regulation. But, and critically, I mean, if in kind of more abstract ways, the state backs central bank money, which is actually fundamental to keeping the financial system going, and there's command over world money, which with the we see really the dollar acting as a sort of quasi world money. So a run through financialisation. Okay, so where has it come from? Worth saying, I think, that changing capitalism is the norm. So we shouldn't be surprised by change. We shouldn't be surprised that capitalism has moved on. It's a dynamic, contradictory, crisis-prone system. That's really what a global system. So at the end of the 19th century, we saw new methods of production in heavy industry develop. We saw growth of monopolistic joint stock enterprises. And we saw a consequent geographical shift from GB, from Britain to the US and Germany. That's a big change in capitalism at that time. It's the era of formal empires, and as a form of imperialism, as formal empires. End of World War II, further huge change. Emergence of mass production and consumption, what some people call Fordism. The long boom, the increasing dominance of production by multinational corporations. Actually, finance quite controlled, both domestically and internationally. The capital exports limited. The US dominant in this period. Formal empires dismantled. So it's a big change. So change is the norm. We just get used to what we used to. Interesting, I put that there so I remembered. One of the reasons high taxation on capital income and real estate is actually very important in terms of levels of equality. So it's not, there's growth, which is obviously has, and job creation, which obviously has impact on levels of equality, but you're talking about high taxation. Very important. 1970s onwards, we have the economic crisis in the early 70s, but there are other changes. There are information and telecommunications revolution. There are important changes in capitalism. You see the further development of multinational corporations, so that really they dominate, a huge domination of production and trade. We think that world trade follows world production. Trade follows production. The growth of China into the world economy, and also the phenomenon of deregulation. So again, big changes in the evolution of capitalism. Finance is important. How does finance fit in? Capital accumulation is an institutionally mediated process. So we need to understand the kind of basic model of accumulation that Marx outlines, but we also need to understand that accumulation takes place in a particular soil, if you like, the soil being the regulatory framework. And the rise of finance is in part based on changes to the regulatory frameworks of capitalism, both nationally and internationally. So with one of the most important consequences of the global economic crisis at the start of the 70s is the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, which had regulated exchange rates, pegging the dollar and gold. So the collapse of fixed exchange rates globally, which actually is followed by quite a rapid period of rising inflation. And quite an important part of, I think most people agree, an important part of the story of the rise of finance is the Volcker shock of 1979, when there are huge increases in the rate of interest in order to control inflation, undertaken in the full knowledge that they will push economies further into recession. So recession is a price worth paying for controlling inflation. And the theory is that price stability would lead to overall financial stability and enhance the overall performance and so forth. So you have the collapse of this regulated financial system and the emergence of a liberalized global financial system. So you have deregulation of interest rates, deregulation of financial institutions, lifting of international monetary and financial controls. Independent central banks, inflation targeting become part of the macroeconomic framework. As I said, inflation lowers the value of financial assets and loanable capital. So you've got this new sort of liberated, if you like, finance. The consequence of these changes, I knew that was going to happen. The consequence of these changes, you get growing instability in exchange and interest rates. Now that encourages the growth of international financial markets. It isn't necessarily a plan, but if you have instability and increasing differentials in exchange and interest rates, it encourages speculation. And the liberalised framework facilitates your movement. And so you see huge growth in financial markets. So that's actually that change in the regulatory framework is very important for the emergence of global finance. But having said that, we know neoliberalism is more than just about finance, and it's important to keep saying it. So the role of state in changing these regulatory framework is important. But it's not simply about finance, and some people talk, I think it's Dumbledore and Levy, who talk about resurgent capital, or capital resurgent. Because the neoliberal period in the wake of the economic crisis of the early 70s ushers in huge deregulation of labour markets, growing unemployment in many instances, privatisation, huge attacks on welfare and social spending. But there's also things like the changing composition of output and changes in the labour force. So you've got an increasingly deregulated and casualised labour force that's also increasingly female, which is quite important as a change in advanced industrial economies. You've got new technology, which in lots of ways intensifies work. It instead of liberating us, it revives things like old practices like putting out and piecework, come back in new, modernised, technologically advanced forms, and you get huge growth of service sectors in the industrial core, especially in the Anglo-Saxon core, which raises a question for some, which is financialised capitalism a service economy or necessarily a service economy? We can come back to that. So that's the basic story in a nutshell. But just to sort of underline some of the key implications. We're talking about real accumulation lacking in dynamism. We're talking about growth led by consumption as households are increasingly indebted and borrowing and tied into the formal financial sector. we're also with the shift from, we're talking about a shift from labour, neoliberalism is about a shift from labour to capital, if nothing else. If you want to, anyone ever wants you to give them a one-line summary, that's what neoliberalism is about. It's about a shift from labour to capital, and you can demonstrate that in lots of ways. One way is the labour losing income share. There are national differences, but it's a general trend throughout the neoliberal period, labour losing income share. So, with it, inequality has grown, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world. Partly tax regimes, you know, the shifting from labour to capital. Actually, capital has gained enormously from tax regimes. Partly financial practices of non-financial corporations. This is a big theme in financialisation literature. That actually big corporations, particularly in the United States, have really driven rising inequality. Because senior management, their pay is so tied to stock options. And so that managers have an incentive to seek short-term rises in share price. And this has given rise to the whole notion of the shareholder value and the shareholder value movement, which has been particularly theorised by Lazonic, who's very interesting, but I mean, I don't buy into shareholder value as the key driver of financialisation. Which I hope will become clear why. But you know, there's a kind of ideology of the shareholder value movement grows up and develops as a justification in lots of ways of lots of the changes that have taken place, and crises are frequent throughout the period. So this is the picture, and we're talking about neoliberalism. Then as a shift from labour to capital, but particularly through the mechanism of financial liberation, a shift to particular forms of capital, not other forms of capital. Yeah. So we're talking about big redistribution in this period. So, how do we understand all this? I'm going to skip over this and not talk in great detail about the sort of fine distinctions in different theorists, because there are lots of fine distinctions, and it would take a long time. So I'm going to be sort of make some sweeping generalizations. Again, hope you can forgive me. And I'm just going to talk about fairly quickly about sort of broad themes in Marxist literature and broad themes in post-Keynesian literature, just as a way of trying to map us through the terrain. So we can always come back to it in questions. And there's quite a nice paper by Kostas Lapavitsas who discusses some of the different approaches and goes through the different approaches to financialisation which I've used. So, the Marxist approaches to financialisation, there are many more than are here, and I should really have Kostas as his own, perhaps RMF. I don't know if that's unfair to RMF as their own school. I'm uncertain, but if we just talk about I think particularly the monthly review school raises a kind of critical question. So let's just put it boldly, which is, are we saying we had a huge economic crisis in the early 1970s, and then we got financial deregulation and massive growth of financial speculation. Are we saying really there's a crisis of profitability, in some ways, understood in some ways, and you've got capital seeking refuge in the sphere of circulation, because the sphere of production is bad. Yeah, I mean, just to put it in its sort of stark terms. So capital seeking refuge in the sphere of circulation and speculative financial activities. So financialisation is emerging as a way of absorbing investable surplus. And that's a very kind of common notion. And my honest approach is, when I discuss these literatures, it's like I don't think that it's like there's no one who's completely right and no one who's completely wrong. So, there's lots of insights everywhere you go. To me, it's a question of how you're fitting it together. Just to skip over Origi for a minute, the regulation school, similar themes within it. So we're talking about a historic shift to a finance-led accumulation regime. So, finance is now the fundamental driver of accumulation. So, that's for some an epochal transformation. Finance is now leading capitalist accumulation. So, finance-led regime. Dummel and Levy, I haven't got a name for them. If someone can help me with a name for what school who we would describe Dummel and Levy, but they've done. I would recommend you look at their work if you're interested in this, because they've done stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of empirical work, which is fascinating. Really locating rising profit rates for finance as at the core of neoliberalism, the greater instability. Giovanni Origi is interesting, but he's slightly different in that he has a kind of grand cyclical theory of capitalist development and the longue durée and systemic crises of stability and finance coming to the fore as when hegemonic powers decline. It's interesting, but I don't really. It will take me away from my core concerns too much to go into Origi. But we've got big questions posited here then about the nature of the global accumulation regime, the role of finance in it, and whether the rise of finance is a response to a crisis in the rate of profit, or in monopoly capital's inability to find outlets for investable surplus. Those have been two different approaches, but important. So, they're broad themes in Marxist approaches. Again, there are broad themes in post-Keynesian approaches. Some of them have affinities with Marxism, if you particularly look at Crotty, who's really, really good. But also Epstein and Pollin. Here, I think the emphasis switches more to the ascendancy of the rentier, I think, which can be interpreted as rising shareholder power, the shareholder value movement as the sort of equivalent of the rentier, the classic rentier. And that the rise of the rentier is a consequence of state policy that we've discussed, which is having a depressing effect on the real sector. So we've got the strengthening of finance at the expense of industrial profit, which is inducing poor performance in investment and output. That's the kind of core of the post-Keynesian argument, which has, rightly they point out, led to a shift in the balance between labour and capital. And the solution is state intervention to regulate finance to improve output, employment, and incomes. So the key thing here is the ascendancy of the rentier. Now, I mean, I find just as there are very important insights here, there are actually important insights in the post-Keynesian work, and there's some interesting empirical work done by post-Keynesians. I find that there's a simplistic dichotomy in a lot of it, which is that poor performance of one is simply caused by the expansion of the other, without really kind of disaggregating the forces at work, which allows you to put it back together, I think. If you disaggregate those forces, it allows you to put them back together in a much more satisfactory, much more complicated, but in a much more satisfactory way, I think is what I would say. So, what I think I would try to say, I see it, you can, I'm open. Some of my thoughts are tentative here, so I'm not firmly fixed. But it's not simply the escape of productive capital. That's not simply what's going on, the escape of productive capital to the realm of finance in search of higher profits. It's not simply the turn to finance at the expense of production. So it's not quite my first straw person, and it's not quite my second straw person, if you know what I mean. I think we need to look more deeply. There's a change in the mix of financial and non-financial activities that are essential to the circuit of productive capital. That's what I think. Okay, and this has implications for financing investment, for the pursuit of financial profit, and for the organisation of non-financial corporations. So, if you like, when we talked earlier about financialised accumulation, what we need to look at, I think, is the financialisation of productive capital, and how this is systemic, has become systemic, and that if we look at it in that way, that helps us really illuminate the processes that are taking place with financialisation. So, to get back to the question of circuits of capital, very important, and raised by Simon earlier. It does help us a lot in understanding the kind of sort of living reality and movement of the capitalist economy. So, just to recap, stroke, repeat. Okay, capitalist production is a structured whole. We can agree with that. Capitalism, I think we can argue, is a totality, but with different spheres. Interdependent, but different. Production, circulation, and distribution. I mean, I've put some references, but there are many other things you could look at. But as Simon was saying, production is dominant for Marx. Production is dominant. Production and circulation are also linked, but they possess their own logics, which is important. Production creates value. The motive is profit, surplus value, which is gained from the exploitation of labour, aimed at the accumulation of capital. Circulation, we're including finance in circulation here, does not create value. It results in profits through redistributing surplus value. The traded object of finance is loanable money capital, which is the core of capitalist credit. Capitalist credit, which is absolutely necessary for production, for the circuit of production. As we saw with Simon earlier, actually everything starts with M. Whilst production is dominant and production is key and production is the size of the source of the creation of value, actually everything necessarily starts with M. So the whole the provision of capitalist credit is central. So we're talking about interconnected processes with their own logics. Now, just to make sure, I mean, this is something needs to be said. This is not new. Financial and monetary dimensions have always been critical to the productive circuit of capital. So, we need to just bear this in mind in terms of committing money capital to initial investments, receiving commercial credit to buy inputs, advancing commercial credit to sell output, borrowing loanable capital to expand or maintain your circuit, handling payments, receipts, hoards of money, receiving the money value of output to ensure the circuit is maintained. Very, very important to ensuring the successful maintenance of the productive circuit of capital. here, in my attempt to kind of boil down and simplify, this is how I find it useful to look at, because Marx is fascinating and quite wide-ranging on finance, and obviously contradictory and so on. But I find this helpful, so here we go. I think he makes two useful distinctions. One is the question of as interest-bearing capital and other forms of capital, whether they're in production or exchange. That's one distinction. But there's also a distinction between real accumulation of capital and fictitious accumulation, to repeat. Now, real accumulation occurs through the extraction of surplus value in production. It involves industrial and merchant capital. It occurs and refers to growth of stock of industrial and merchants' capital. So it's talking about growth of stock. That's accumulation. Fictitious accumulation refers to paper claims on surplus value yet to be produced but traded in financial systems. So we've got the question of what's the balance between real and fictitious accumulation. And so most simply, it's important to say that the balance between these two forms of accumulation is historically determined. It's dependent upon institutional frameworks, but institutional frameworks themselves are a product of historical evolution of class relations and class compromises and so forth, the soil in which accumulation takes place. So we've got this taking place within accumulation, rising out of the necessary needs of accumulation, rising out of the necessary needs of the productive circuit of capital, because finance is essential to the productive circuit of capital, as we've said, as we've seen. This is what I've just said. So real accumulation requires the financial system. So real accumulation is what gives rise to the financial system. It's not that it's independent, but it varies in time and space, which then introduces the question of Hilferding. Because Hilferding is very important, and finance capital, which is 1910. So Hilferding is very important, and Hilferding is really great. And I'm going to criticise Hilferding, or I'm going to say Hilferding's, in many important ways, is not what we need to understand the present. But that don't anyone say. I'm not saying don't read Hilferding, because Hilferding is really, really important and really, really good. But for the present purposes, what Hilferding says is, so he's writing in 1910, it's in Germany, he's saying in the course of accumulation, monopoly capital, so we've got the emergence of monopolies, relies increasingly on banks to fund its fixed investment. And so what he talks about is his notion of finance capital is the fusion of industry and banks. So they're coming closer and closer together, so that they form a block, the block of finance capital. And some people say it's an overgeneralization of the particular conditions of Germany at the time, which I think is a fair point. But as I say, still reading. Very close reading of Volume 2 of Capital, which is really, really good. But in terms of understanding the present, that doesn't help us. So we're not talking about finance capital, as we're talking about financialized capital, which is what I'm trying to convey. Because in many ways, we have this opposite dynamic today, whereas financialization, at least in part, is about the separation of industrial capital from finance capital. And the increasing financialization of industrial corporations themselves, which in turn is inducing this refocusing of banks to financial trading, financial services, individuals, and so forth. So it's the pulling apart of the two, and the response of the banks to this in many ways. Yeah? Yeah. So that seems to me very, very important and fundamental to understand what's going on. So, neoliberalism, This is based on a co-written article, so I should acknowledge my co-authors, Ben Fine and Susan Newman. But what we're saying is that the neoliberal period has witnessed this combination, so the subordination of real accumulation to fictitious capital in lots of ways, with the expansion of speculative assets at the expense of real investment, the element of the picture which post-Keynesians do quite capture and do study, but also the integration of real accumulation into the realm of interest-bearing capital, which is really, really important in understanding this notion of financialised accumulation. But the financialisation of productive capital necessarily entails a transformation of financial activities, as well as a change in the balance between financial and non-financial activities, integral to the circuit of productive capital. So it's not just that there's a balance between the financial and non-financial, but then there's the question of transformation within financial activities themselves. This gets us back to the question of non-financial corporations altering their core activities, the importance of internal financing for non-financial corporations, and the changing balance of external finance by non-financial corporations. So we need to disaggregate the external financing of non-financial corporations, which I'm not going to do now because I don't have time. So that's kind of my take based on what's going on, trying to link it to Marxist circuit of capital. So, to conclude, I didn't talk for as long as Simon, I'm relieved. Okay, I'm going to start my conclusion then by just throwing out a couple of big questions. Obviously, we have one thing raised here is the question of periodizing capitalism and how and whether and so forth. And I think that there's general agreement in the literature across financialisation. And I think I don't think there's anyone really within Marxist political economy who dissents from the view that finance really is now the key kind of dominant feature of contemporary capitalism. And so that we can talk about a new period of capitalist development. However, finance-led, however we want to particularly, whichever particular label we prefer, financialised accumulation or a finance-led accumulation regime, or however you like it, finance-dominated world economy, however you choose to express it, there's a general agreement that I think that the way that finances, these changes do amount to a new period in capitalist development. Is it an epochal change? I don't know. I think we should then discuss exactly what epochal means. But I think we have gone through a structural transformation. That I would say. The other question that which I think needs to be looked at in the light of that statement is the question of the prospect for reform of finance. Now, there are lots of ways you can look at reforming finance. And there are lots of measures for reforming finance which I'm thoroughly in favour of. I'm Tobin taxes, and there are lots of things you could do to control and regulate finance. Lots and lots of things. Questions then are raised. Is the process too far to can you get the toothpaste back into the tube? It's a difficult task, but it seems to me that for us, particularly if you're looking at Marxist political economy and activism and so forth, it seems to me that the question of finance and reforming finance doesn't want to be left to the narrow debates around how to reform the financial system so that it functions more nicely and smoothly and efficiently and less crazily. Whilst within that debate there are lots of things that one might agree with that should be done and ought to be done. For us, it seems to me that given the connection between neoliberalism and finance, the question is how do you connect broader struggles for state intervention with the struggle, with the fight to reform finance. And so state intervention shouldn't be seen as simply about a simple regulation of finance, but about the question of raising much broader questions about social provision. And the question of housing, health and education and public provision and the provision of finance for in these areas, and changing macroeconomic policy and industrial policy so that it's job creating and not destroying, which is relevant in different contexts, in different forms. And so when we talk about control over capital, both domestically and internationally, that necessarily means control over financial capital. Do you see what I'm saying? That the emergence of financialized accumulation means actually fighting finance means fighting the current form of capitalism, and so it needs to be tied to broader questions, monetization and commodification and so on, but for public and social provision, for state intervention. So regulation of finance needs to be understood and advocated in terms of a much broader vision of the interconnections with social housing, health and education and so forth. So, I'll stop there. Shall we take some questions or shall we break for lunch early? I'm easy either way. I'm looking for guidance.
Well, let's maybe spend 2 or 3 minutes if there are specific questions.
Okay.
It seems no bad thing to have an hour and a quarter for that.
It seems no bad thing, I agree. So.
What makes Marxists think that financial institutions are not production?
Okay.
You can't hear the questions at the back. The mics are detached.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
It just pulls out. There's a button on the mic somewhere. Yep.
The question was, what makes Marxists think that financial activity is not production?
My question is about the last conclusion you make about the comment you make about control, and I was thinking about what Hilfring was saying when he almost saw the financialisation as something positive because it could be the root of a revolutionary socialist strategy to seize control of finance capital and distribute it egalitarianly. How do you feel about that?
Okay, there's lots of questions.
I can shout.
Yeah, yeah, I think you can actually.
Given what you... given what you emphasize as a systemic, process, how do you explain the relationship between finance and accumulation in China?
Good question.
I have something which is somewhat historical in terms of its context. So the move away from productive to finance capital, you could paint this as, I want to kind of re-inject the class element in the analysis a little bit. So the move away from productive capital to finance capital, does this signal a movement away from the strength of labor? So lots of commentators would say that the 70s was a site of strong trade unionism, and there was a need for capital to move away from this strength because it was challenging the rate of profit. And so would you say that working class resistance and class-based politics have been undermined by the movement from productive to finance capital? Yep.
I gave the microphone to two, so I just have one question. Okay. It's very difficult for me to understand, to talk about labor theory of value in such extent over the previous lecture, and now talk about Hilferding. It's quite obvious to me that if you follow Hilferding, you cannot follow an understanding of the social process in capitalism in terms of labor theory of value. They contradict.
These questions are great. I'm not quite sure I'm going to be able to answer them all. Shall I just gather them up and save them for later? Okay, good, good. Okay, maybe one more then.
Thanks. Is it possible for you to talk more about what you understand about periodization, different from other Marxist approaches you mentioned, like regulation school?
Can I just ask whoever gave the second question, could they just repeat? I didn't get to talk.
Yeah, I'm having difficulty here because I can't write them down and
sorry,
give out the microphone.
I was wondering about the potential that Hilferding saw in increasing financialization as a potential for socialist strategy through popular seizing democratic control over the financial system, and how that ties into what she said about control over financial capital, and basically your personal opinion on that as a socialist strategy.
Shall I say a few things? Hard to answer the question about China, but clearly you point to a very important feature, which is that China's extraordinary development has not been based upon a neoliberal model of finance, and there's huge state intervention and control over the financial system in China, which obviously reflects a broader pattern of development, which is often now discussed under the rubric of developmental states, particularly if you live in a society that's declared itself to be a developmental state, and it's actually very big across Africa that we should be developmental states, and often the sort of paradigmatic case is South Korea. The interesting relationship between the state and the financial sector, because obviously day one of the dictatorship, the entire financial sector was nationalised, and that really was the basis of the direction and control of capital, which allowed South Korea to industrialise in the way that it did. So the question it raises the very general question of the relationship between industrialization and industrial development in a financialized context, because China shows what's necessary if you're going to achieve it. So, periodization. Well, I mean, that's again very important, and I'm sure we should come back to it later on. But I think certainly one dimension of periodization, which is important, is the question of the effects of changes in accumulation and the state on social reproduction more generally. So it seems to me the relationship between production and reproduction is important for periodization, and that finance is affecting the nature of social reproduction through the reliance on private provision. So I would say that. Yeah. Is that enough for now, do you think? Yeah, very big questions. So yeah, later. Shall we break for lunch then? 10 to 1, back at 2? Sorry, I'll come back to you. Oh, I'm coming out. are you?
Alexander Polkar.
Hi, Sam. Yes, of course I remember. How was Russia?
Dominant contradictions.
Yeah, okay.
Problems. So really,
You always a good answer.
yeah. First of all, congratulations. This is really interesting and very difficult lecture. And second, I want to talk a little bit with you, or maybe with another colleagues, about opportunity to cooperate, because we have system of education in Marxism. You have this Rosa Luxemburg Figure in Germany has some attempts to help and so on. Maybe we can make more or less international cooperation to organize exchange of presentations. So the question is where and how, when, and how can we sit for 10 minutes together?
I mean, the person to talk to is Simon. He organises these training workshops. So he would have, he had all the presentations.